And we are live with Miss Paul. Hi, welcome back to the Astroholic Live. I am your host, Alfredo, and we have our co-host. I think it's this way, yes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Luis Costa da Silva. It's really nice to be back.
He's a doctor now.
I am a doctor now.
Can you believe it? And we have our guest.
Hi, I'm Dr. Paul McKay.
Welcome, Paul, and hopefully this time you can hear us, which is a much improvement on last time. I think I solved all the issues thanks to the help of producer Chris, who is in the background. Yes, we are very happy to be back with this special on COVID vaccine. So we will be asking Paul to tell us a little bit about what he does, and then we're going to have a little cocktail, and then we're going to ask him lots of questions about the vaccine, etc. So,
okay, so,
please.
I make vaccines and I test them to see whether they work, and I modify them to make them better. And then once we're happy with the vaccine and how the immunogenicity works in animals, we then move into testing them in people. And this last year, actually it was 1 year ago yesterday, I picked the clone for the Imperial College vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually created 1 year ago on the 29th of January. So once we have constructed the vaccine using our self-amplifying RNA technology, we're then able to test it and see whether it works. And we have got through to the phase 1/2 human clinical trials already with that vaccine.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about how such a type of vaccine, an RNA vaccine, work?
Oh, so the RNA vaccines are really like a very pared down type of vaccine. It's basically just a piece of RNA which is encapsulated in a ball of lipids. So the lipids are lipids like cholesterol and other phospholipids and a ionizable lipid, which is able to hold the RNA inside it, protect it from the environment. And of course, that's one of the major disadvantages of RNA vaccines, is that RNA is one of the most labile materials that you can think of. If you walk past a piece of RNA on a bench, you'll probably destroy it. So keeping it safe is important, but also trying to be able to get it delivered into a human cell or an animal cell is quite a task. And this little ball of fat, which protects it from the environment, is also the delivery vehicle that is able to take it into the cell, and then the RNA is able to be translated into protein, and the protein, of course, can be anything. So the RNA is really just a message, a code for the protein that you want to make, and trying to protect it and make it get into the cell is the important thing. Our particular RNA is a self-amplifying RNA.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, instead of just being like a messenger RNA, which is the one code that for, like, say, the spike protein, the surface protein of coronavirus, it also, just before that code, it carries code which makes proteins that is able to replicate itself. So it takes with it its own machinery to make itself again. And that's the clever and interesting thing about self-amplifying RNA vaccines. And that's in contrast to the vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer that are out there, which are simply messenger RNA vaccines. So ours is a very, very long piece of RNA, so it takes a little bit of extra protection.
Sounds good. So I'm assuming that things are still being checked and evaluated. Are you planning a phase 2?
So it's in phase 1/2. So
okay, sorry.
We are not at the minute planning for the efficacy part of the trial, because with there already being 5 vaccines which have been shown to be successful, and many of which are going to come to the market in the next few months, some of which are already here and being injected into people, it makes it very difficult to conduct an efficacy trial in the United Kingdom because we need to have people that are naive to the vaccine. And you can see that if we already have nearly 8 million people vaccinated, it makes it very difficult to do that large-scale efficacy trial. So we would have to go to a country where vaccines aren't available, and of course that is actually ethically difficult at the moment, and not from the point of view of like we would be giving people a vaccine which we think works, but of course we haven't proved that it works. So why wouldn't those people be entitled to get a vaccine that has already been proven to have worked? So those are the ethical questions which would surround that type of study. So at the minute, we're focusing on the idea of getting our vaccine to a stage where we can use it as a booster for either people who have already got one shot of the vaccine or for next year for the annual booster, which may be necessary. And that's what we're focusing on at the minute. And that's not an entirely crazy idea. In fact, yesterday, I published a preprint in bioRxiv with the group at Oxford. So this preprint shows that our vaccine, together with their vaccine, is able to synergize really well. So ours boosts their vaccine boosts our vaccine, and in fact the combination is better than 2 shots of the single one alone. I mean, the caveat with that study, of course, being that was in mice and not in people, and mice are very good at showing differences in responses, but they're not necessarily indicative of what happens in a human situation in the real life.
Cool. Thank you very much. You're really bringing some hope about everything that's happening, so that's very good to hear. Before we ask you a question, Lucia, have you already got questions?
I do have questions, yeah.
Awesome. Before we do, I have a drink for you that's, if you checked out last time, I only mimed it. And it's a gin, elderflower and apple juice cocktail. I had completely forgotten. I had a very cute name for it, and now I've completely forgotten. But I'm using the Astroholic gin. It's not focusing. It's all right. I'm using the Astroholic gin that I made last year just before lockdown.
Oh wow!
So, and it's surviving mostly intact. Producer Chris.
So I need to go and get my, because I used up all of the elderflower.
Oh yes, you can improvise.
So I'm just going to go and find myself a glass of wine.
Find yourself a glass of wine.
I'll be right back.
Don't worry. So, what is in the? What I'm making it is a shot of gin, a shot of. I'm using Saint Germain, which is an elderflower liqueur, but you can use elderflower syrup. I just realized, you know what I've not been checking? I've not been checking Twitter if people are commenting and etc. See, I should have to be doing that as well. 1 second, I will also jump on that. And if you are, use the hashtag, the Astroholic Live. What else? You see, we're learning about doing this completely virtual. It's definitely been a learning curve. Luis, what are you drinking? Have you made yourself something similar to mine, or are you improvising?
I've improvised as well, and I've recently discovered that I really like Martinis, which I hadn't up until now. But I'm quite specific. I either like them with the dirty ones, of course, with a little bit of olive brine, or what I call I don't know what I call it really, but my style martini, and it's basically made with vodka, and it's very specific, vanilla vodka and a lemon twist, and I really like that combination of those flavors, so that's what I'm drinking.
That sounds very nice. Producer Chris, there is a drink for you on the corner. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to check the hashtag and Twitter if anyone is commenting. Okay, Lush, start asking questions. And cheers.
Cheers.
Right. So I think a lot of people have a lot of questions and concerns about the vaccines, and there's like a lot of information around them, not necessarily sometimes in the most helpful way. You said the vaccine was ready a year ago, right?
Yes.
Yeah, which is really remarkable considering that a year ago we're still learning quite a lot about the virus. And
well, it had been created, but there was no testing that had been done.
Yeah, so that's kind of my question, because I think I've read that it happened with other vaccines as well, where they were pretty much ready way before we started talking about vaccinations and when we first started talking about all of that. So what is kind of the process between that stage and where we are now? Because you mentioned that obviously there are animal trials and then there's trials with humans. Could you just give us a little account of what it entails from like the inception of the vaccine until the end?
Sure. So once you've got the actual vaccine created, of course, it doesn't just come out of nothing. It comes on top of all the work that various different labs and people have done before. For example, the Oxford vaccine used technology that Professor Gilbert had been developing for 15 years. So, and she actually made a MERS version of that vaccine quite a number of years ago. So once you've got the bit of code that will make the spike protein from the outside of the coronavirus, once you've got that into your vector, you have to then make that vector into something that can be delivered. That's the very first step. So for us, that means putting it inside that small ball of fat. So for us to do that, we had to and you have to do it in very precise ways. You can't just do it as if you're doing it in the lab. And we can do most of those steps ourselves, but they have to be to a standard called GMP, which is the standard that's needed before you can ever inject it into like an animal for a toxicology study or to people. It has to be a medicinal product. So we make the clone that it will express the spike protein, and then we sent what we did. I'll say what we did exactly. We sent it off to a place in San Diego. First of all, we grew up lots of it so that they could use that as a DNA. And they're the people that make the RNA. It's a company called TriLink, and they have this GMP process for making RNA. So they made a bulk quantity of the RNA for us, and then we got them to send it to Vancouver, and this company called Acuitas in Vancouver then put it into the little ball of fat, and then they sent it back to us. So the reason why we do it that way is because these people have got the GMP process for their particular part of the process is completely able to be put into people and has been audited and shown to be accurate and safe and consistent. So once they send it back to us, then we're able to use that material and first of all start doing animal studies. The animal studies are necessary because you need to first of all show that the thing that you've made is immunogenic, so it is able to elicit an immune response in the animals. So once you've shown that it's immunogenic, that's like step -1. That's a prerequisite for everything. Then you have to start in the whole system of going from the initial immunogenicity studies into the people. And to do that, you have to do these processes called toxicology studies. So these are essentially usually done in rats and rabbits, and they are where you inject your investigational product into the animal, and then over time you see exactly what happens. And every organ of, the animals, of course, are killed after the injection at various times. And every organ, every tissue of that animal is examined in minute detail to see whether there's anything weird going on. Like if you inject something into the leg, does the liver then start to have problems? Does the lung have problems? Is there any kind of issue with the thing that you've injected? Does it destroy tissue? And these are all the sort of tox package, they call it. And you have to basically get a squeaky clean result from that. If you inject something into a rat, which causes the rat to suffer ill health, then obviously you're never going to take that thing into people because it's like a real gatekeeper. If you inject something into the muscle of the rat and you see some muscle damage from the needle injection, that's fine because that's what happens when you inject things. But then if you see something like, not only do you see the muscle damage in the rat, but it becomes necrotic, then that's, the whole thing would stop. So there's many parts of the whole process where it can just be brought to a halt. And we saw this actually with one of the vaccines, the molecular clamp vaccine from Australia, the University of Queensland, where they had a piece of actually HIV protein, which they used to sort of keep their spike protein together in a certain shape. And because they had that GP41 HIV protein in there, they started to see positive, false positive results in HIV tests from the people that volunteered in that trial. And just because of that false positive result meant that would never be a product that you could ever use in people, because you can't go around giving people false positive tests in HIV. So then that was completely stopped. So, and then once we've got to the stage where we've got it into people, the first stage in people is to see, does this cause the same sort of immune response in people that we've seen already in the animals? And if it does, that's great. Then you go on to the next stage and you say, so you're basically saying, is it safe and does it cause an immune response? And then you would move finally to the efficacy trials. And the efficacy trials are basically saying, how good is it? Is it any good, or is it really good, or is it just average? Wow. And of course, for most of the vaccines that we've seen already with the coronavirus, we've seen that they've got a greater than 90% efficacy, which means that 9 out of 10 people are protected. So that's the whole process in a nutshell.
That's good.
Yeah,
really
that was
good.
Fantastic.
Fascinating.
Thank you. Okay. Lush, have you got a little bit of science for us this week?
I do actually, yeah. And well, I don't know if everyone knows that was watching my field is mental health and psychology, particularly youth mental health. And a lot has been going on related to the impact of COVID. And there's a lot of projects that are in their inception at the moment because we're starting to get data on mental health for the COVID period. So there's a few things happening. But one really interesting paper that came out in between our last Astroholic and now has to do with something that's not very well researched and also really interesting to study during COVID times, which has to do with passage of time. So, well, objectively speaking, time passes at a constant linear rate. But our subjective, from a psychology perspective,
fine.
Yeah, but subjectively though, we have an experience of time passage which is influenced by many other things like the activities that we're doing or the emotions that we experience. And there's actually a great number of studies that show that this time perception can be altered depending on a myriad of reasons, but they generally study this in lab settings and also time periods of less than 1 minute. So we don't really know a lot about what happens, for example, in the event of a global pandemic. And we know from previous studies that things like emotions, your cognitive capacity, any kind of mental ill health that you may be experiencing, your cognitive load, or drug administration, of course, can impact the way that you perceive time passage. But there's a study that was done in the UK, actually, recently, which looked at around 600 participants and their time perception distortion. So what they're looking at is something called passage of time judgments, which is your it's the subjective speed at which time is passing for you. So it can be more quickly than normal, it can be as normal, or it can be more slowly than normal. And they looked at a sample during the COVID-19 lockdown in the UK, and what they found is that 80% of the sample experienced distortions of time, which we've all been under lockdown, so we can all relate to this to a certain point. But they found really interesting things as well, other than this, which we all expected, really, because we all experienced it. But the time distortion did not go in a single direction for all the participants. What I mean by that is like faster for everyone or slower for everyone. It was kind of like split almost evenly across those who experienced this distortion of time. So kind of half of those who did experience it going slower, and half of those who did experience going faster. So that's quite an interesting ratio there, which, and other things that they also found particularly interesting in their regression analysis, that things like age, satisfaction with your levels of social interaction, and stress and your task load from work were the only factors that were predictive of this passage of time perception. So the likelihood of your day passing more slowly increased when you had increased stress, reduced task load, when increasing age, so if you were older, and if you had a decrease in satisfaction with your levels of interaction, social interaction. So basically, the more dissatisfied you were with your social interaction, which we all were at some point, the slower time would pass for you subjectively. So there's quite a lot to unpack on this study, and they looked at a myriad of variables. It's really interesting, and you could all have a read, but I thought it was a really interesting thing to bring because we all experienced it, but these guys actually went on and measured it, which is pretty cool.
That's amazing, but also, have anyone studied people that experience time passing sometimes slowly and sometimes very fast? Because...
Well, trying to remember, because I read this paper a while back, but what I remember they found is that if you found your day to pass faster or slower, the same perception would happen for the week as well. So you had to rate the day and then the week at the end of the week. So if you experience those days slower, then you would also overall experience the week going slower.
See, I don't know if you guys have experienced this or anyone who's watching, you can comment if you had. But for me, it's been... If I think about the lockdowns, now number 3, they've been extremely slow and drawn out. But we also 29 days from March. So I still feel that I'm in March 2020, and yes, the new March is approaching. So I have this kind of paradox in my head that it's... I just miss people and places, and the clock doesn't move, but also, oh my god, it's already March again?
I know. It is pretty interesting, and one thing that I would like someone to have a look at, and I don't know how feasible this would be from like a research design perspective, but how monotonous your days are, or how your next day is pretty much the same as the day before, has an impact on this perception of time. Because I feel that if you were to introduce kind of like a surprise element to your day, so if you were doing something different and you had a bit of like more randomness into your day, as opposed to this kind of like streak of days that look exactly the same over and over and over again, that might have an impact on how you perceive time going, because that happens outside in the real world, and you tend to feel like, for example, if you are planning things over weeknights, it does feel like the week goes faster for you because you had like different things, and you saw this friend on one day. Remember those days? You saw friends and like those things. So that could be really interesting to see if introducing a random activity would have an impact on perception of time passage.
Okay, so everyone who's watching, that's your homework. Organize your week with stuff and surprises. If you're living with flatmates or a partner, I don't know, just jump out of a closet or hide in the shower like Psycho.
Yeah, it could be small things. You like, do your exercise in the morning, do it in the evening, swap things around in your day.
Breakfast for dinner.
Yeah, something like that.
I just had the producer Chris that has threatened me to don't surprise him at all. So our week is going to be monotonous.
It's for science, Fred. It's for science.
It's for science. Exactly, it's for science. So that is all good. Okay. My science stories for the week. I have two that are. The theme is orbits. Because it's, yes, I theme my stuff. No, it's because two very interesting stories came out at the early this week, and they're all to do with some cool orbits. So the first one is about exoplanets, and it's a 6 exoplanet system, and 5 of those exoplanets they are in resonance. What does that mean? It means that they're orbiting in a nice rhythmic pattern. If I remember correct, the second planet from the star, every time it does 18 orbits. The third planet it does 9. The fourth planet it does 6. The fifth planet it does 3, and the sixth planet it does 2, precisely. And so there is this lovely harmony in the system. And this has been seen in several other systems, and it's also happening in the Galilean moon of Jupiter, that they all orbit in this nice little rhythmic pattern. But what is fascinating about this particular system is all the planets are very different. Some are much bigger and some are much smaller, different density, which suggests that this resonance is not something that, oh, hello. What is this handsome boy or handsome girl's name?
Handsome girl.
Handsome girl.
You little thing.
Who's that? You were talking about planets.
Yes, we're talking about planets, and now we're distracted. You see, we never had a canine guest before. You see, this. You might think the drawback of the pandemic is we've not been able to do this, but now you see it's all positive. So we now can have dogs in our shows as well. Yes, planets. I lost my train of thoughts, but I'll come back to me. Yes, they're all different, which might suggest that the formation of this kind of system, very harmonious system, doesn't don't have to form all together, all in the same way, so all these planets, which is very exciting. And the second story, it's about eclipsing binaries. So sometimes stars are aligned with our line of sight in a way that they eclipse each other. So you have two stars, they orbit each other quite closely, and they regularly pass one in front of the other. We know plenty of eclipsing binaries. What we hardly seen is eclipsing binaries in multiple systems, and we found a system that has 6 stars, and all 6 of them are in pairs that eclipse each other.
Oh, that's cool.
So it's a 6-tuplet eclipsing system.
That's amazing. Whereabouts is that?
That is in the constellation of Eridanus, which is in the southern hemisphere. So the southern hemisphere constellation is all stuff made up in the 18th and 19th century by European navigators. So you will see that it's just there is the ASL, the telescope, the microscope. It's all very much colonialism and very much industrial revolution fun. But the constellation of Eridanus, and I've known the constellation for years, but I never realized it's named after the longest river in Italy. But it's Latin name. So the name in Italian is Po. But its Latin name is Eridanus. And for some reason, it's very river-like, this constellation. It's Eridanus. So it's 1,200 light years, and it's very exciting. They managed to, so you have 2 stars eclipsing every 8 days. There's 2 other stars that eclipsing every 3 days, I think. And these 2 groups, they orbit each other every 4 days. Every 4 years. And then there is these other 2 stars that are orbiting each other every few days as well. And the whole system, they orbit around each other every 2,000 years. Super cool. But if you're like, okay, I like this idea of seeing 6 stars all at once, but I don't have a telescope, I cannot go on, I'm not in the southern hemisphere. How do I go and find stars like that without having to travel? Especially since you cannot travel unless you're in the southern hemisphere. Well, Castor, one of the stars in Gemini, next to Pollux, is the second brightest, is also a 6-star system. And although in that 6-star system in Castor, only 2 are eclipsing binary from our point of view. But the fact that all of the 6 stars in this system, Eridanus, the all eclipsing binary, is very interesting in terms of formation, because researchers think that actually the 3 biggest stars in each pair, they form first. They will surround it by a gas, and actually 2 formed first, and the third one came in, and that disturbed the equilibrium, created the system, and also allowed the rest of the gas to condense in a smaller star that all started orbiting in this nice little plane.
That's really cool.
I thought so. I thought you would appreciate that one.
That's really cool. So it's been quite eventful for your field lately.
Well, when the plan when we had last time, I was ready to have so many stories because it was the end of the American Astronomical Society meeting, which is a good excuse for everyone to just like sending press releases and like, hey, cover this. But January tends to be a good month for innovation, for new papers and stuff. But it's, I think there is a lot of complexity in doing science over the last, 12 months, almost 11 months. And I feel that some fields are a bit much easier than others. When it comes to astronomy, there is a lot of I can use this data from a space telescope and I can do it in my gym jams at home. Not that I did that while I was doing a PhD and there was no pandemic. No, I always dressed up and went into the office. Every day. Good boy. But I'm sure that is Paul will have a problem to try and do some cell work or from the comfort of your own sofa.
Yeah, it might be a bit messy. Yeah. So one thing I was thinking of, so I was wanting to ask you guys was, what is your impression of how things are going with the vaccines and the vaccine rollouts?
Okay. Shall we discuss a little bit of politics?
Well, I wasn't really thinking of the EU and stuff like that. I was thinking more of just like.
Don't worry, we have been very much political because science is political. But explain more. Which kind of what did you mean?
So the way that the vaccines are being rolled out, like if we just start in this country, and the people that are, the rates of people that say that they're going to get a vaccine has gone up quite dramatically. And I suppose that's not unexpected because once you see people having a successful vaccine and nothing bad happening, then it gives you confidence that it's fine. But the availability of vaccines and whether teachers should have them, all of that kind of issue. I like to get the impression of people that aren't, so intimately involved in vaccines, just to see what other people are thinking.
Okay. between here and so my my main issue here, I think it's been good in the number of first doses, but I know that there is a lot of science supporting the idea of spreading them out and still trying to give a little bit of protection to as many people as possible. It's, I don't know, it just feels that that is not what is been tested for. We know that we're getting some data on that approach, and I'm hoping that is very positive, and I want to believe that the scientists that made that gave that advice to the government are proven right, and that we truly have protection for most of. We're now almost 8 million people, around 8 million people.
Yeah, nearly 8 million.
Yeah, so that even if it's not 95% efficacy, if it's 90, that means that like over 7 million people that had protection. That is fantastic. I definitely think that there should be consideration for people that are in they are more at risk. I can work from home. It doesn't impact me if yes, I would like to have a vaccine because I would like to be protected. I would like to go out and hug people, etc. But if somebody tells me what's necessary for this country is like reopening schools, it's crucial to keep the country running, then vaccine, it's teachers must be vaccinated. If that is crucial, then it must. If what is crucial to keep this country running is that supermarket and people that stock supermarket and people that work in supermarket are open as much as possible, or that deliveries are increased, people that on those jobs must be vaccinated. It's the fact that there needs to be. It's good that the categories more at risk have been. Well, the focus is on them, but as it open, I think there should be a consideration on how best to protect the people that are more at risk, and not just based on health and age, but on their chance of exposure.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that's my main concern. I think that the effort that the UK is putting into the vaccination program is tremendous, and the NHS is working non-stop. And yeah, so many people have already had the vaccine, so many people you actually know, which is very different than hearing it, oh, people are getting a vaccine and you know people that have had it. My partner has had it, for example. So it feels very tangible at this stage, which is quite hopeful. But I do worry as well that some of the groups that should be vaccinated are not even being considered. And like Alf is saying, people that work in essential services like supermarkets. And even if we are to keep the economy continuing and not try to avoid a big collapse, which paired with Brexit will be disastrous, and small businesses and all of those people, I think this criteria needs to be added to the list to make it less about health, but also a more social criteria, really, and the level of exposure as well. But otherwise, I do think that, I don't know, because I see back home how things are, and the perception people even in Europe have of the UK's vaccination program is really positive, which must be like the first thing that's been positive
for years.
Out of the child. So I do think so. I mean, up until then, it was basically us and Israel were doing a really big effort, but there's things to be said about Israel's vaccination program that are sad. But yeah, I think overall positive, but would like more clarity about like the time periods between the first and the second dose, which I think there's been a lot of talk about and not really a lot of clarification from the government itself, really.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree with that. I was surprised that they decided to change the schedule from the 3 or 4 weeks to 12 weeks. 12 weeks for a vaccinologist seemed to be quite a long time for a boost shot. I would have been probably quite happy at 8 weeks, because that's within. I mean, when the way the immune system works is you give your prime shot and it builds up the initial immune response, and then it goes in a sort of a wave, and then gradually calms down with no inflammation by about 6 to 8 weeks, and then it'll continue on its downward trajectory for depending on the particular antigen for a long time. But usually at that downward slope is when you give the boost, so that you have got enough cells circulating in your body that will have the opportunity of seeing this boost. If you leave it too long, then sometimes it just goes down too low, and then your boost will be lower than it might have been. And we would normally have looked at that in either animals or people first before making those kinds of decisions, and sometimes it's totally fine. But while the clinical trials have been very rigid in their parameters, then changing that parameter is quite a strange thing to do, because you're saying, oh, this works with 95% efficacy in this parameter, and then if you then change them artificially, then nobody can say they still work at 95%. They can say that they probably still work, and probably is not a great word for science and for a clinical trial outcome. So I would prefer that it was shorter, but I can understand completely that, the early data showed that 2 weeks after the first immunization, the amount of hospitalizations totally tanked. So people were almost completely protected from having this severe disease and dying. And that was kind of the sort of practical decision that they made, in that if you can prevent people from dying, then that's a big thumbs up, and people being hospitalized. So that was what the decision was based on. But it's not ideal, and if we could possibly have, the whole of Europe could have enough vaccines to vaccinate the population properly, that would be the optimal situation. But we're obviously very far from that.
Sorry, Lewis.
No, I have a question, which is quite a scary one, but I can wait.
Okay. My only comment is, yesterday, I think it was yesterday. Sorry, time. We already discussed that. The Johnson & Johnson Janssen single shot vaccine came out, and it has an overall efficacy of 66%. But it completely protects from severe cases. There are no hospitalization and no deaths. And I kept seeing people complaining online that, oh, I would never get that. It only protects 6. And I'm just like, it stopped you from having severe COVID or dying. That's amazing. Like, it's not time to get snobby about vaccine.
But this is comes back to, I mean, I think people have learned a lot about vaccines and immunology over the last year. But it comes back to the general misconceptions over what all of these numbers mean.
Mm-hmm.
So 66%, we have to remember this is after one vaccination. And 2 weeks after that one vaccination, you are protected from, severe disease, which is absolutely incredible and amazing, and well above even the target the WHO set of 50% for any vaccine to be considered. So to have that kind of efficacy doesn't mean that you can't then get another shot at some other time. It just shows you how powerful this one intervention is. And comparing it then to a 2-shot regimen is, false equivalency. It's not the same thing. It's like something that's able to protect you, and protect the world. We have to think of this actually on a global level as well, because the ability to provide vaccines for some places in the world is actually really difficult. And if you can get one hit in there, that's brilliant. But having the chance of getting 2 hits into like a village in some part of the world is sometimes not possible to do. So to have a vaccine that can actually protect all of those people is just nothing short of amazing.
I'm very glad. Lush, what was your question?
Well, it's kind of related to this. So we've seen it's about the strains and vaccine efficacy against the strains, which again is a really hot topic at the moment. But like we've seen these strains coming out in countries where the administration of or the management of COVID has been shambolic. So like the USA and Brazil and the UK, and the strains came up, and there are people making cases for the fact that we let the virus run rampant, and that kind of catalyzed the strain and the mutation. So is there a risk, for example, if when we look at countries that will not be getting the vaccine as quickly, or certain parts of the world which are not so accessible, is there a risk of we getting the so-called developed world with vaccination programs, and then we have other countries where this is not happening, and then the virus might proliferate there, and a new strain comes up, and then we'll have like these hot pockets of a really serious strain, for example, that can permeate then into countries that have already had vaccination programs, and then we are in a perpetual state of pandemic?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is that there's a lot of moving parts there, in that there's a number of countries in the world where actually the virus isn't spreading as well as it is here. So if we just look at, for example, the continent of Africa, there was a large number of countries where there was virtually no spread, and now there's a couple of countries where it's spreading quickly. So you can see that the viral dynamics takes part, it plays into this, in that sometimes the virus does race through a population, and sometimes it just doesn't seem to. So while certainly in the US and the UK, and a large number of countries in Europe, not all of them, but quite a few, they've been very poor at preventing the spread of the virus in the population. And so we've had these cyclical lockdowns. I mean, France is going into another complete lockdown again, because for some reason people here don't seem to consider that this infection is something that they should necessarily worry about if they're under the age of 70 and have otherwise good health. But of course, that's not the case. Anybody who gets COVID will have some effects of the disease, even if they don't feel it. Sometimes it can cause scarring of the lungs. Sometimes it can cause weakness of the heart muscle. There's a lot of extra things that happens whenever you get a COVID infection. And so people should be more concerned about it than they are. And that's partly the media's fault of saying that this is just like the flu. And of course it isn't at all like the flu. And this is just like the other coronaviruses that circulate as common colds. Yes, they are similar to those, but this one isn't the same as the circulating ones. Like SARS-1 was not the same as the circulating ones, where it killed 10% of the people it infected. So fortunately, SARS-2 killed a lot fewer than that, but it was still quite a large number of people. And it's left some people like with permanent disabilities. So the fact that people don't appreciate that is part of the problem. So the whole social distancing and mask issues have been, derided as being unnecessary. Although, and even when most people in the country do actually adhere to it, of course, it only takes 5-10% of people to keep it spreading. But and a separate issue to that is that if you have the vaccine and you still have good spread in a population, it means that the virus, which is an organism which is adapted to survive and replicate itself, the Red Queen hypothesis, in the face of obstructions, the vaccine becomes an obstruction that then starts to try and fight against and mutate away from. So if you have a vaccination in a setting of constant circulation of the virus, you are going to get the emergence of new mutations. And that's a bad thing, but I don't want to scare people into thinking that these new mutations are necessarily always bad. Viruses always have the tendency to also mutate towards survival of themselves and survival of the host. So while some mutations, of course, will crop up which make it more infectious, like the UK Kent variant, there's other mutations which will crop up which make it survive better with less bad consequences to the host that it's living in. But yes, in the context of a vaccinated population, there may be strains that arise that will escape the vaccine.
This one actually brings to a question that I wanted to ask, that I heard this interesting hypothesis, and probably is going to be the last question for the night. There is, I can't remember where I read it, but this idea that the COVID will probably evolve, mutate into something that is just going to be with us forever, but it will be probably something. Oh, that was my ring. Well, 1 second. That Producer Chris runs. See, the joy of live broadcasting. So, do you think it's likely there's going to be something that it's always going to be with us? That probably just will notice in children that suddenly they lose the sense of smell and taste for a few days or something like that. So.
I think possibly. I mean, it's also possible that it will just disappear because it is fighting against 5 other coronaviruses that circulate in us. So it could become just like one of those. Some of the variants of the SARS-2 you don't lose sense of smell. The South African one, apparently, you do not have the loss of taste and smell for whatever reason, because of his particular affinity for the receptor, perhaps. But I'm hoping it will disappear, or it will be modified into and become like a less virulent type of virus. But you just don't know what will happen.
Well, I'll drink to hopefully it will disappear, and
yes, I hope so too.
And see the back of this coronavirus.
I cannot wait.
There might be another one.
Well, then I would hope that this year has demonstrated just... actually, I would hope that now the governments take seriously the threat of a global pandemic. Because I remember the discussion about the Ebola pandemic in 2014, and seriously, how many countries, and I talk mostly about Italy, because there's been a lot of discussion, and people say, but we don't have Ebola, that doesn't matter to us, and literally the WHO say, no, we need to be prepared, we need to be prepared, because so many people live so close to animals, and it's just like we're gonna get zoonotic diseases, etc. And suddenly, like, oh, maybe we should have been prepared. So between the preparedness in the population and in the policy, but also showing that we can make a vaccine pretty quickly when there is investment and political will. I think this is amazing.
That's what
I mean, it showed us over this last year how important it is to be prepared, for sure. I think people do take it more seriously now.
Good. Next thing to make them take it more seriously, climate change. We can but hope. Convince them before there is like a meter of water where we walk.
Yeah. behavior change is very difficult, and it's one of those things that I actually should have been part of any government's approach to this pandemic, which is shocking that it wasn't part of any of the governments. But that's a different topic, and that's a different discussion.
No, but I actually, it was actually fascinating to see in Europe, like, for example, Asian countries are so used to just be quite selfless when it comes to personal illnesses. People wear masks all the time if they have a cold. Like, here would be possible, at least would have been impossible. Now we'll see what happens in the next few years. But how different I've noticed in different countries. It was I've been able to, over the last 12 months, to just visit home once, but it was fascinating. There were people that just had oh no, never wear the mask, oh no, I left it in the car, no. But they were the minority, and everyone else was just like, why can't you be a little less selfish? And I don't know if I doubt that Italy sat down and just like, okay, how do we change the behavior of a completely 60 million people? But maybe, I don't know, maybe something in the messaging, especially how hard we were hit at the beginning with Bergamo, and seeing the footage of the army vans just taking coffin after coffin after coffin. Maybe death gave a complete different sense of we're doing this for all of us, and it's I don't know if that helped.
I think so, and I think a lot of continental Europe, because you guys were the cautionary tale, and a lot of continental Europe knew this is coming for us, whereas I think there's a bit of like British exceptionalism, and aided by Boris Johnson, kind of like invincible status, herd immunity that really didn't hit home here, because I also went home in the summer, and this was before the UK was even like doing masks regularly, and everyone was taking it really seriously back home. I was like, oh, that must be nice. And I think a lot of it came from, honestly, this sense of like insularity, but not closing the borders, and like the exceptionalism was like, oh, we're better than them, we have better whatever. And the message never went into the public of like, you guys need to be careful, because otherwise we'll end up like Italy or Spain or
And I think is this message of selflessness, and is the fact that you're doing to protect yourself, but by protecting yourself, you're protecting everyone.
Yeah, we're doing that now with those ads that some of them actually blame the public, but that's a different conversation. But we're trying to pass on that message of, because appealing to behavior change in that way is way more effective than an abstract way, because we're humans and that's how we do things. But it's too late now, because we are over 100,000 people dead, and we can try to mitigate it, but I think it might be too late at this stage.
On that note about not being able to change behavior, maybe you should take a leaf out of the Catholic hat and make people feel guilty immediately. We conclude tonight, and thank you very much for joining us on the Astroholic Live. Thank you, Paul, so much for your incredible explanation and this incredible insight into how to actually make a COVID vaccine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It was our pleasure. I have been Dr. Alfredo Carpinetti.
I've been Dr. Luis Costa da Silva.
Thank you very much, and